Clara Thompson had everything most people dream about, the kind of life that looks perfect in Christmas cards and social media posts. A sprawling mansion in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the city, the type of place where the driveways are longer than most people's streets, and the landscaping costs more than a year's salary. Her husband, Marcus Thompson, was the golden boy of the financial district. Sharp suits, sharper smile, the kind of man who commanded attention when he walked into a room. They were the couple everyone envied at charity galas and country club events. Picture perfect, or at least that's what everyone thought. But if you looked closer, if you really paid attention, the cracks were already there. They'd been there for months, maybe even years. Clara just hadn't wanted to see them. Or maybe she'd convinced herself they didn't matter. That's what love does sometimes. It makes you blind to the truth that's staring you right in the face. The pregnancy had been difficult from the start. Clara had wanted children desperately. She'd spent years imagining what it would be like to be a mother, decorating nurseries in her mind, picking out names, dreaming of tiny hands and first steps. When she finally got pregnant, she thought it was the beginning of the happiest chapter of her life. Twins, 2 babies, double the blessing, double the joy. That's what everyone told her. But her body had other plans. From the very first trimester, something felt wrong. The morning sickness wasn't just morning sickness. It was all day, every day, a relentless wave of nausea that left her weak and dizzy. She couldn't keep food down. She lost weight instead of gaining it. Her doctor put her on bed rest at 5 months, warning her that the pregnancy was high risk. The twins weren't growing at the same rate. There were concerns about their positioning, about her blood pressure, about a dozen medical complications that Clara tried not to think about too much, because the fear was paralyzing. And through it all, Marcus was absent. Not physically absent at first. He was there in the house, sleeping in the same bed, eating breakfast at the same table. But he was gone in all the ways that mattered. When Clara tried to talk to him about her fears, about the doctor's warnings, about how scared she was, he'd nod absently and change the subject to a deal he was closing or a client he was courting. When she asked him to come to her appointments, he always had a meeting he couldn't miss. Always. Every single time. The night Clara went into labor, she knew something was terribly wrong. The pain wasn't supposed to start like this, sharp and sudden, like something inside her was tearing apart. It was too early. Still 3 weeks before her due date, she called Marcus 7 times, and he didn't answer. Not once. She finally called an ambulance herself, hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone, and rode to the hospital alone, scared out of her mind that she was going to lose her babies. The emergency C-section was a blur of bright lights and urgent voices and pain that cut through the epidural, like it wasn't even there. Clara remembered the doctor's face, tight with concentration. She remembered a nurse holding her hand, a stranger's kindness, when the person who promised to love her forever couldn't be bothered to pick up the phone. And then she remembered the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard. 2 cries. Her babies. Both of them alive. Both of them breathing. Marcus showed up 4 hours later. 4 hours after his children were born, he finally walked through the door of her hospital room, tie loosened, smelling like whiskey, and making excuses about a client dinner that ran late, about his phone dying, about traffic. Clara was too exhausted to fight, too overwhelmed with relief that her babies were okay. She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. So she did. She smiled weakly and let him hold the twins, let him take photos for social media, let him play the role of the proud father while she bled into her hospital gown, and tried not to think about how alone she'd felt in that delivery room. The 3 days in the hospital were hard, harder than Clara could have imagined, learning to breastfeed 2 babies while recovering from major surgery. The pain medication made her foggy and confused. The nurses were kind but busy. And Marcus? He visited once a day, stayed for maybe an hour, held the babies for a few minutes for more photos, and then left. Always with the same excuse. Work, always work. He had a business to run, deals to close, clients to impress. Clara told herself she understood. She told herself it would be different when they got home. She was right about that. It was different. It was so much worse than she could have ever imagined. When the hospital finally discharged her on day 3, Clara was still in rough shape. The incision burned with every movement. She was bleeding heavily, something the doctor said was normal but still terrifying. She could barely walk more than a few steps without feeling dizzy, but the babies were healthy, and that was all that mattered. She'd called Marcus that morning to tell him they were being released, and he'd said he'd be there to pick them up. For once, she thought, for once he's going to show up when I need him. The taxi ride home cost $60 that Clara didn't have in cash, so she had to use a credit card. Marcus hadn't come. He'd texted her an hour after she'd called, saying something came up, telling her to get a cab, promising he'd be home when she arrived. Clara sat in the back of that taxi with a baby carrier on each side of her, trying not to cry, trying to ignore the sympathetic looks from the driver in the rearview mirror. This was supposed to be one of the happiest days of her life, bringing her babies home. Instead, she felt like she was barely holding herself together. When the taxi pulled up to the mansion, Clara felt a small flutter of hope. Maybe Marcus had been preparing something. Maybe that's why he couldn't pick her up. Maybe he'd decorated the nursery, or ordered flowers, or done something, anything to show he cared. She paid the driver, slowly maneuvered the 2 car seats out of the taxi, and made her way up the long driveway, every step sending fresh pain through her abdomen. The front door was unlocked. That should have been her first warning. Marcus was obsessive about security, always setting the alarm, always checking the locks. But Clara's mind was foggy from exhaustion and pain medication, and all she could think about was getting inside, getting the babies settled, and maybe finally getting some rest. She pushed open the door, struggling with the weight of the 2 car seats, and that's when her entire world shattered into a million pieces. Marcus was standing in the foyer, but he wasn't alone. Next to him, practically draped on his arm, was a woman Clara had never seen before. Tall, blonde, wearing designer clothes that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She was stunning in that polished, deliberate way that takes hours of effort to achieve, and she was smiling, actually smiling, like this was all some kind of wonderful surprise. Clara's brain couldn't process what she was seeing. For a moment she just stood there, frozen, holding her 2 newborn babies in their carriers, still bleeding through the heavy-duty pads the hospital had sent her home with, her body held together by surgical staples and sheer willpower. She looked at Marcus, waiting for an explanation that made sense, waiting for him to tell her this woman was a colleague, or a real estate agent, or literally anything that would make this scene less insane than it appeared. But Marcus didn't offer an explanation. Instead, he looked at Clara with an expression she'd never seen on his face before. Cold, disgusted, like she was something dirty that had just tracked mud across his pristine floors. And then he said the words that would echo in Clara's mind for months afterward, words she'd replay over and over, still unable to believe they were real. "Pack your things. This is Vanessa's house now." Clara actually laughed. It was a short, disbelieving sound that came out before she could stop it, because this had to be a joke, a cruel, horrible joke, but still a joke. This couldn't be real. Her husband of 5 years, the father of the 2 babies she was literally holding in her arms, babies who were only 3 days old, couldn't possibly be telling her to leave their home. Their home. The place where she'd lived for the past 4 years, where she'd decorated every room, where she'd prepared the nursery for their children. But Marcus wasn't laughing. He wasn't smiling. He just stared at her with those cold eyes, waiting for her to understand that he was serious. And the blonde woman, Vanessa, apparently, she was smiling wider now, like she'd won some kind of prize. Clara's voice, when she finally found it, was barely a whisper. "Marcus, what are you talking about? I just got home from the hospital, with our babies, your children. What is happening right now?" Marcus sighed, like Clara was being deliberately difficult, like she was the unreasonable one in this situation. "I don't have time for dramatics, Clara. Vanessa and I have been together for over a year. We're making it official. This is her house now. I need you to pack your things and leave." The world tilted. Clara felt like she was falling even though she was standing still. A year. He'd been with this woman for a year, through her entire pregnancy, while she was on bed rest, scared and alone. While she was in labor, calling him desperately for help. While she was in the hospital, recovering from surgery, learning to feed their children, she wanted to scream, she wanted to rage, she wanted to demand answers, to fight, to make him see how insane this was, but she couldn't, because she was holding 2 3-day-old babies, and one of them was starting to fuss, and her incision was throbbing, and she could feel wetness seeping through her clothes, and she realized with horror that she was bleeding through her pad, through her pants, and this couldn't be happening. This absolutely could not be happening. "Marcus," she said, and she hated how weak her voice sounded, how desperate. "Please. I just had surgery. I can barely walk. Where am I supposed to go? Just, let's talk about this. Whatever's wrong, we can fix it. Please." But Marcus was already moving toward her, and Clara realized with dawning horror that he wasn't going to talk. He wasn't going to explain. He wasn't going to give her time to process or pack or even think. He grabbed her arm, the one that wasn't holding a baby carrier, and started pulling her toward the door. Clara tried to resist, but she was weak, so weak, and every movement sent agony through her surgical site. "Marcus, stop, you're hurting me, the babies." He didn't stop. He pulled her right out onto the front porch, car seats and all. Clara was begging now, tears streaming down her face, not even caring about her pride anymore. "Please, Marcus, please. I have nowhere to go. My father's dead. I don't have any family. Please don't do this. The babies need—" But Marcus just let go of her arm, and Clara stumbled, nearly dropping the car seat. She caught herself at the last second, her body screaming in protest. And then she heard it, the sound that would haunt her nightmares. Laughter. High, bright, delighted laughter. Vanessa was laughing. This woman, this stranger, was standing in the doorway of what used to be Clara's home, watching a woman who'd just given birth get thrown out into the street with her newborn babies. And she was laughing like it was the funniest thing she'd ever seen. Marcus stepped back inside, and the door closed. Clara heard the lock click. Final. Definitive. She stood there on the porch, holding her 3-day-old twins, still in her hospital clothes, bleeding and broken, and she couldn't move. She literally couldn't make herself move. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. But the rain that started falling was real. The cold drops on her face were real. The weight of the baby carriers in her hands was real. And slowly, painfully, Clara made her way down the driveway, away from the mansion that was supposed to be her home, away from the life that was supposed to be hers. She walked for 10 minutes before her body gave out. 10 minutes that felt like hours. The rain was coming down harder now, soaking through her thin hospital clothes, and she could hear her babies crying, confused and scared and hungry. She needed to feed them. She needed to change them. She needed to do 1,000 things that required a home, a safe place, supplies she didn't have. Clara spotted a bus stop and stumbled toward it. The small shelter offered minimal protection from the rain, but it was something. She set the car seats down carefully, checking to make sure the babies were okay, and then she sank onto the bench, every muscle in her body shaking. She pulled out her phone with trembling hands. 2% battery. No charger. No way to charge it even if she had one. She had $12 in her wallet. $12. That was everything she had in the world. Marcus had always handled their finances. All their accounts were in his name. Their credit cards, their investments, everything. She'd trusted him completely, and now she had nothing. Clara scrolled through her contacts, looking for someone, anyone who might help. But there was no one. She'd lost touch with her college friends after she married Marcus. He'd always said they were a bad influence, that they were jealous of her life, and like a fool she'd believed him. She'd let those friendships fade. Her mother had died when she was 16. Her father had passed away 3 years ago. She had no siblings, no cousins, no one. The rain was relentless. Her babies were crying, and Clara felt herself starting to slip away. The blood loss, the pain, the shock, it was all too much. Her vision was blurring at the edges, going dark. She thought maybe this was it. Maybe she was going to die right here at this bus stop. And what would happen to her babies? Who would take care of them? And then, through the haze of pain and exhaustion, she felt her phone buzz in her hand. 1% battery. One last notification before it died. She looked down at the screen, expecting nothing, and saw a text from an unknown number. "My daughter, I prepared for this. Watch the video I sent to your email. Trust no one but Margaret Hale. I love you, Dad." Clara stared at the message, read it again and again. Her father. But that was impossible. Her father had been dead for 3 years. She'd been at his funeral. She'd watched them lower his casket into the ground. She'd cried over his grave. This had to be some kind of mistake, or a cruel prank, or a hallucination brought on by blood loss and trauma. But something made her open her email, some desperate, drowning part of her that was willing to grasp at anything, even an impossible message from a dead man. And there it was, an email dated 2 weeks before her father's death. Subject line, "When you need this most." Clara's about to read a message that will change everything. But first, you need to understand who her father really was. Clara stared at her phone screen, rain dripping from her hair onto the cracked glass. The message didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. Her father, Samuel Ward, had died 3 years ago. She remembered every detail of that day with painful clarity. The phone call from his neighbor, the rush to his apartment. Finding him there, peaceful in his armchair, the doctor said it was his heart. A massive coronary, quick and painless. That's what they told her. That's what she'd believed. She'd planned his funeral. A small service because Samuel had been a quiet man who kept to himself. He'd worked as an accountant for a mid-sized firm, lived modestly in a rent-controlled apartment, drove a 15-year-old sedan. He'd raised Clara alone after her mother died, and he'd done it on a modest salary, sacrificing everything to make sure she had what she needed. College tuition, a safe neighborhood, a good life. She'd loved him desperately, and she'd mourned him deeply. She'd visited his grave every month for the first year. She knew he was dead, but this message, this impossible message, it was signed Dad, and something about it, something in the phrasing, in the way it was written, felt like him. The formal structure, the clear instruction, the expression of love that he'd always been too reserved to say out loud, but would write in birthday cards and notes left on the kitchen table. Clara's hands were shaking as she opened her email app. Her phone was at 1%. It could die any second. She scrolled through her inbox with frantic speed, looking for anything from her father, knowing it was impossible, knowing she was probably having some kind of breakdown, but unable to stop herself. And there it was. Sent 3 years and 2 weeks ago, right before he died. Subject line, "When you need this most." Clara had never seen this email before. She checked her email religiously, every day. How had she missed this? Unless it had been set to send only now. Only when something specific triggered it. But what? How would a dead man know when to send an email? Her babies were crying. Both of them now, hungry and wet and confused. Clara knew she should tend to them. She knew they needed her. But her thumb was already pressing on the email, opening it, and nothing could have stopped her in that moment. The email was brief, just one line of text and a video attachment. "My dearest Clara, if you're reading this, everything has gone exactly as I feared. Watch this video, all of it. Then call Margaret Hale at the number below. Trust her completely. Trust no one else. Everything I've done for you. I love you more than you'll ever know, your father." Below that, a phone number. And below that, a video file, 52 minutes long. Clara's phone buzzed a warning. Battery critically low. She had maybe 2 minutes before it died completely. Not enough time to watch the video. But she had to know. She had to see, even if it was just a few seconds. Even if it made no sense. She pressed play. Her father's face filled the screen, and Clara gasped. It was him. Older than she remembered. More tired, but unmistakably him. He was sitting in what looked like a hotel room, and he was staring directly into the camera with an expression she'd never seen on his face before. Not the gentle, slightly worried expression he'd worn through her childhood, not the proud smile he'd given her at her college graduation. This was something different. This was the face of a man who knew terrible things and was preparing for war. "Clara," he said, and his voice was exactly as she remembered it, And she started crying all over again because she'd forgotten how much she missed that voice. If you're watching this, it means I was right about Marcus. And I'm so sorry. I wish I'd been wrong. I wish I could have protected you from this without the deception. But if you're seeing this now, it means he's shown his true colors. It means he's hurt you. And it's time for you to know the truth. All of it. Her father took a breath, and Clara could see him gathering himself, preparing to say something difficult. I'm not dead, Clara. Or at least, I wasn't when I recorded this. I will be by the time you see it. But not the way everyone thinks. I faked my death. I know how insane that sounds. I know how much pain it must have caused you. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But it was the only way to protect you. The only way to give you what you'd need when Marcus finally revealed who he really is. Clara's phone screen went black. Dead. The battery had finally given out. She stared at the blank screen, her mind reeling. Her father had faked his death. Why? How? And what did any of this have to do with Marcus? She looked down at her babies. They were both screaming now, red-faced and desperate. She needed to feed them. She needed to find shelter. She needed to figure out what to do next. But all she could think about was that video, her father's face, his words. I faked my death. I was right about Marcus. It's time for you to know the truth. Clara made a decision. She picked up the baby carriers, pain shooting through her abdomen, and started walking. She had $12. There was a coffee shop 2 blocks away. They'd have outlets. She could charge her phone. She could watch the rest of the video. And then she'd figure out what came next. The walk took 20 minutes. 20 minutes that felt like 20 hours. By the time Clara pushed through the coffee shop door, she was dizzy from blood loss and exhaustion. The barista took one look at her, at the babies, at the blood seeping through her clothes, and immediately brought her water and asked if she needed an ambulance. Clara shook her head. She ordered the cheapest thing on the menu with her $12, took the table nearest the outlet and plugged in her phone. The babies had exhausted themselves, crying, and fallen into a fitful sleep. Clara waited, watching the battery icon slowly climb from 0 to 1% to 2 to 5. As soon as it hit 10%, she opened the video again. Her father's face reappeared, frozen mid-sentence. She pressed play. I need to start at the beginning, Samuel continued. The truth about who I really am. Clara, I lied to you your whole life. Not about loving you. Never about that, but about everything else. I wasn't an accountant for a mid-sized firm. I mean, I was, on paper. That's what my tax returns said, that's what everyone believed, but that was just cover. What I actually did, I managed assets for some of the wealthiest people in the world. Clara felt like she was floating outside her body, watching this happen to someone else. Her father, the man who clipped coupons and bought generic brand cereal and drove that ancient sedan, managed assets for billionaires? I know you're confused, Samuel said, like he could see her through the camera, through time itself. Let me explain. Your grandfather, my father, he was the real deal. Old money, generational wealth. But he was also a drunk and a gambler, and by the time I was 20, he'd lost almost everything. I had to rebuild from scratch. I was good with numbers, good with strategy, and I had connections, people my father had known. I started helping them quietly, making their money work harder, finding opportunities nobody else saw. Within 10 years, I'd made my first 100 million. For my clients, not for me. I never kept much for myself. He paused, and Clara could see the weight of old decisions in his eyes. I could have lived like a king. God knows my clients wanted me to. They kept offering me more, bigger cuts, partnerships. But I saw what wealth did to my father. I saw how it corrupted everything it touched. And then your mother got sick. Clara's hand went to her mouth. Her mother. Lung cancer. She died when Clara was 16. When your mother was diagnosed, I had to make a choice. I could use my real wealth, my hidden wealth, to get her the best treatment in the world, experimental therapies, top specialists, or I could keep my secret and watch her die. I chose the secret, Clara. I let her die to protect you. His voice broke, and Clara saw tears on his face. Your mother knew. She knew about the money, and she knew I was choosing not to use it. And she agreed. She made me promise, because we both knew that if the world knew who I really was, what I really had, you would never be safe. You would never know if people loved you or for what you could give them. You would never have a normal life. And your mother and I, we wanted that for you more than anything. A normal, safe, happy life. Clara was sobbing now, understanding flooding through her. Every sacrifice her father had made, every time he'd said no to something she wanted, not because he couldn't afford it, but because he was protecting her. So I stayed hidden, Samuel continued. I lived modestly. I made sure you had what you needed, but never so much that you'd ask questions. And I watched you grow into this remarkable woman, smart, kind, strong, everything your mother and I hoped you'd be. And then you met Marcus. The way he said Marcus's name, like it tasted bitter. I ran a background check on him immediately. Of course I did. That's what fathers do, especially fathers with the resources I had. And at first, everything checked out. Good family, good education. His business was legitimate. He seemed to genuinely care about you. I thought maybe I'd been wrong to be so paranoid. Maybe he was one of the good ones. Samuel leaned forward, his face hardening. But 6 months after your wedding, I caught something. A search on his computer. I had monitoring software installed on all devices connected to your home network. For security purposes, I told myself, to protect you. And one night Marcus searched for how to access wife's trust fund without her knowledge. Then he cleared his browser history. Clara felt ice in her veins. That search told me everything I needed to know. He didn't love you. He loved what he thought you might inherit from me, what he thought I had hidden away. So I started digging deeper, and Clara, what I found... He shook his head. Marcus was already having an affair with a woman named Vanessa Cartwright. I found emails between them. They'd been together for 3 months, and they were planning something. Samuel pulled out a folder, opened it to the camera. Clara could see printed emails, text messages, photographs. They were planning to trap you. Marcus wanted to get you pregnant. He said, and I quote, "Once she has a baby, she'll be too distracted to notice what I'm doing. And when the old man dies, everything comes to her. We just have to wait." They talked about it like you were a mark, like you were a job. Rage, pure, white-hot rage was flooding through Clara now, burning away the despair. "So I made a plan," Samuel said. "A long-term, comprehensive plan. First, I faked my death. I had to disappear completely so Marcus would think he was close to getting what he wanted. I had to make him confident, overconfident, because confident people make mistakes." He smiled then, and it wasn't a kind smile. It was predatory. "Then I started building your safety net. The mansion you're living in. I bought it. Secretly. Through a trust called the Ward Family Trust. Marcus thinks he bought it. He thinks his name is on the deed, but it's not. It's yours, every square inch. I structured it so carefully that no one would know, unless they looked at exactly the right documents." Clara's mind was spinning. The mansion was hers? His company? Thompson Capital? Every dollar he used to start it came from me. But I didn't give it to him as a gift. I loaned it to him, with you listed as guarantor. In the paperwork he signed, which I made sure was complicated enough that he just skimmed it, it clearly states that if he defaults on any payment or violates certain behavioral clauses, you have the right to seize all assets. And Clara, one of those behavioral clauses is marital infidelity. Samuel's smile widened. He signed away everything without even realizing it. And the best part? I've been documenting everything. For 3 years, I've had investigators following him, following Vanessa, recording their conversations, tracking their spending, building a file so comprehensive that any lawyer would drool over it, every hotel room, every lie, every plan they made. I have all of it. He set down the folder and looked directly into the camera. The bank accounts he uses? They're in your name, the credit cards, yours. The investment portfolios, all yours. Marcus has nothing. He owns nothing. He never did. He's been living in your house, spending your money, building his life on your assets, and he has no idea. Clara felt something shift inside her. The broken, desperate woman at the bus stop was gone. Something else was taking her place. Something harder. Something dangerous. "I've set up a trust account for you with $50 million, Samuel continued casually, like $50 million was nothing. "It's accessible only by you. The account information is in an envelope with Margaret Hale. She's the attorney I hired to handle all of this. She's been working on your case for 3 years. She knows everything. Trust her completely." He leaned back, and his expression softened. "Clara, I know this is overwhelming. I know you're probably sitting somewhere right now, scared and hurt and wondering how your life fell apart so completely. But sweetheart, it didn't fall apart. It was revealed. There's a difference. The life you thought you had was a lie. The life you're about to build, that's going to be real. And it's going to be yours. Completely. Absolutely yours." Tears were running down his face now. "I'm sorry I won't be there to see it. I'm sorry I won't get to hold my grandchildren if you have them. I'm sorry for every lie I told you, even though I told them to protect you. But I'm not sorry for this. For giving you the tools to destroy the man who tried to destroy you. Use them, Clara. Use everything I've given you. And when you've won, when you're standing in your mansion with your head held high and Marcus is nothing but a bad memory, know that I'm proud of you. I've always been proud of you." He reached forward and the video cut off. Clara sat in that coffee shop, staring at the blank screen, and felt herself transform. Her father had given her a kingdom. He'd spent 3 years, the last 3 years of his life, building an empire designed for one purpose, to catch the man who betrayed her and make him pay for it. She looked down at her sleeping twins, her beautiful babies. Marcus had planned them. He'd gotten her pregnant deliberately, as part of a scheme to steal from her dead father. He'd used her body, her love, her trust, to create 2 human beings who were nothing but pawns in his game. But they weren't pawns, not anymore. They were heirs. Heirs to everything Samuel Ward had built, everything he'd hidden, everything he'd protected. Clara pulled her babies close and whispered, so softly that no one else in the coffee shop could hear, "Your grandfather just gave us a kingdom. Now Mummy's going to become a queen." She pulled out the phone number her father had left. Margaret Hale. She was going to call this attorney, this woman her father had trusted with everything. And then she was going to do exactly what her father had prepared her to do. She was going to destroy Marcus Thompson. Not with violence, not with anger, but with something so much more powerful. With the truth, with evidence, with the law, with 3 years of surveillance and documentation and careful planning, with assets he didn't know she owned and money he didn't know she had, and an attorney who'd been building a case against him since before Clara even knew she needed one. Marcus thought he'd won. He thought he'd gotten away with it. He'd thrown her out of her own house, stolen her life, betrayed her in the cruelest way possible. And right now, he was probably celebrating. Probably laughing with Vanessa about how easy it had been, how stupid Clara was, how perfectly their plan had worked. But what Marcus didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that he'd been caught from the very beginning. Every move he made, every lie he told, every secret meeting with his mistress, all of it had been watched, recorded, documented, filed away in folders that were waiting for exactly this moment. Clara looked at her phone, at her father's message, at the number for Margaret Hale. She took a deep breath, feeling strength flood through her body, despite the pain, despite the exhaustion, despite everything she'd been through. Marcus had made one fatal mistake. He'd underestimated her. He'd thought she was weak, helpless, dependent. He'd thought that throwing her out would break her completely. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. Clara's about to walk back into that mansion. But she won't be alone. She's going to have backup that will make Marcus wish he'd never been born. Stay with me, because what happens next, it's going to be beautiful. 3 days after watching that video, Clara walked through the doors of Hale & Associates, a law firm housed in one of those buildings that screams money before you even step inside. The kind of place with marble floors so polished you can see your reflection, with art on the walls that probably costs more than most people's houses, with the kind of hushed, reverent atmosphere that makes you whisper even when there's no reason to. Clara didn't look like someone who belonged there. She was still recovering from the C-section, still moving slowly and carefully. She'd borrowed clothes from the shelter where she'd been staying, a simple dress that was clean but obviously second-hand. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail. No makeup, no jewelry, nothing that suggested she was anything other than what she appeared to be, a desperate woman who'd been thrown away and was looking for help. But inside, Clara was different now. The video had changed something fundamental in her. The despair was gone, burned away by rage and purpose. She knew who she was now. She knew what she had, and she was ready to use it. The receptionist looked up when Clara approached, and Clara saw the quick assessment in her eyes. The kind of look that said she was already categorizing Clara as probably not worth the firm's time, probably couldn't afford their rates, probably going to be shuffled off to some junior associate who handled pro bono cases. But Clara just smiled politely and said, "I have an appointment with Margaret Hale, Clara Thompson, though she might know me as Clara Ward." The receptionist's expression changed immediately. She picked up the phone, spoke quietly into it, and within 30 seconds, a woman appeared from the elevator bay. Tall, late 40s, with steel-grey hair cut in a sharp bob and eyes that looked like they could see right through you. She was wearing a suit that probably cost more than Clara's wedding dress had, and she moved with the kind of confidence that comes from never losing. "Clara," the woman said, and her voice was warm but professional. "I'm Margaret Hale. I've been waiting 3 years to meet you. I only wish it were under better circumstances." She held out her hand, and when Clara took it, Margaret's grip was firm and steady, the handshake of someone who meant business. "Follow me," Margaret said, and led Clara to a private elevator that required a key card to operate. They rode up in silence, and Clara used the time to study the woman her father had trusted with everything. Margaret had the kind of face that gave nothing away. You couldn't tell what she was thinking just by looking at her. But there was something in her eyes, something fierce and protective, that made Clara feel safe for the first time in days. The elevator opened directly into what had to be Margaret's personal office. It wasn't like the reception area downstairs. This was a working space. There were files stacked on every surface, law books lining the walls, and a massive desk covered in organized chaos. But what caught Clara's attention was the wall of filing cabinets. 6 of them. Large, industrial-strength cabinets that looked like they could survive a nuclear blast. "Please sit," Margaret said, gesturing to a comfortable chair in front of her desk. "Can I get you anything? Water? Coffee? Have you eaten today?" Clara realized she hadn't. She'd been too nervous about this meeting to even think about food. "Water would be good," she said quietly. Margaret poured water from a pitcher on her desk, handed Clara the glass, and then sat down across from her. For a long moment she just looked at Clara, not judging, just looking, assessing. "Your father was one of the most brilliant men I've ever met," Margaret finally said. "And I've met a lot of brilliant people in my career. I was a federal prosecutor for 15 years before I went into private practice. I put away mob bosses, corrupt politicians, white-collar criminals who thought they were untouchable. I thought I'd seen everything. And then Samuel Ward walked into my office and told me what he needed, what he'd discovered, what he'd planned." She shook her head, and there was something like admiration in her expression. "He spent 3 years preparing for this day, 3 years watching, documenting, building a case so airtight that no lawyer on earth could break it. He paid me a retainer that could have bought a small island, told me to use whatever resources I needed, hire whatever investigators I needed, spend whatever it took to make sure that when the time came we'd have everything." Margaret stood up and walked to the filing cabinets. She pulled out a key, unlocked the first one, and opened the drawer. It was packed with folders, hundreds of them, all labeled, all organized, all color-coded by category. "This," Margaret said, gesturing to the cabinet, "is Marcus Thompson's entire life for the past 3 years. Every phone call, every email, every bank transaction, every place he went, every person he met with, every lie he told. Your father hired a team of private investigators, the best in the business, Former FBI, former CIA, people who know how to dig up secrets that were never meant to see daylight. She pulled out a folder, thick with documents, and set it on the desk in front of Clara. This is his company, Thompson Capital. He thinks he built it. He tells everyone he's a self-made man, that he started with nothing and turned it into a multi-million-dollar success through hard work and smart investing. That's his story. That's what he tells his clients, his associates, everyone. Margaret opened the folder, and Clara saw bank statements, loan documents, incorporation papers. The truth is that every single dollar that went into starting that company came from your father. Samuel set it up as loans, with you listed as the guarantor. Marcus signed the documents without reading them carefully. He was too arrogant, too sure of himself. He saw the money, saw the opportunity, and he grabbed it without asking questions. She pointed to a specific clause in the loan agreement, highlighted in yellow. This clause right here states that if the borrower engages in any fraudulent activity, including but not limited to marital infidelity, conducted with the intent to defraud the guarantor's family, all assets purchased with loaned funds immediately transfer to the guarantor. That's you, Clara. The building his company operates out of, yours. The equipment, yours. The client list, yours. Everything. He's been working for you this whole time and didn't even know it. Clara stared at the documents, her mind struggling to process the magnitude of what her father had done. Margaret pulled out another folder, this one marked with red tabs. "This is better," she said, and there was something dark in her smile. Video surveillance. She opened a laptop, clicked a few keys and turned the screen toward Clara. The video showed a hotel bar. Nice place, upscale. And there, sitting in a booth in the back, were Marcus and Vanessa. The timestamp showed it was from 2 years ago, 6 months before Clara got pregnant. Margaret pressed play and Clara heard Vanessa's voice, slightly tinny through the recording, but perfectly clear. "So when are you going to do it?" Vanessa was asking. "We've been planning this for months." Marcus took a sip of his drink. "Soon. I'm going to get her pregnant. Once she has a baby, she'll be too distracted to notice what I'm doing with the accounts, and she'll be too exhausted to fight a divorce." "What about the kid?" Vanessa asked. "You're not actually going to keep it, are you?" Marcus laughed. Actually laughed. "God, no. Once we have the money, we'll dump the kid on her and disappear. I'm not cut out for fatherhood. This is just business, Vanessa. Get her pregnant, wait for the old man to die, clean out the accounts and start our real life." Clara felt like she'd been punched. She'd known, intellectually, that Marcus had betrayed her. The video from her father had made that clear. But hearing it, hearing him laugh about getting her pregnant as part of a con, hearing him talk about abandoning their child like it was nothing, that was different. That was a level of cruelty she hadn't fully comprehended until this moment. "There's more," Margaret said quietly. She fast-forwarded through several more clips. Marcus and Vanessa at restaurants, at hotels, at her apartment. In every video they were planning, talking about how much money they thought Samuel had hidden away, how they'd access it, what they'd do with it, talking about Clara like she was an obstacle, a nuisance, something to be managed, and then discarded. Margaret closed the laptop. "We have 37 hours of footage like that, enough to establish a clear pattern of premeditated fraud and conspiracy. But that's not even the best part." She pulled out another folder, this one marked with blue tabs. "Vanessa Cartwright. She's not just Marcus's mistress, she's also his business partner, or at least that's what she thinks. She owns a marketing firm, moderately successful, been running it for 5 years. What she doesn't know is that we've been auditing her books." Margaret spread out financial statements, bank records, copies of invoices and receipts. She's been embezzling from her own company to fund their lifestyle. The trips, the hotels, the jewelry Marcus has been buying her, all of it paid for with money she's been skimming from her business accounts. We're talking about $400,000 over 3 years. That's felony embezzlement, prison time. And here's what makes it beautiful. She did it because Marcus convinced her they needed to maintain appearances, that they needed to look successful so no one would suspect their plan. Clara found herself leaning forward, drawn into the web of evidence her father had spent years constructing. But the absolute best piece of evidence, Margaret continued, pulling out yet another folder, is this. She opened it to reveal printed text messages, hundreds of them, between Marcus and Vanessa, between Marcus and his business associates, between Marcus and people Clara had never heard of. Margaret flipped through them, pointing out specific exchanges. Here Marcus calls you the cash cow. Here he tells Vanessa you're too stupid to notice what he's doing. Here he's talking to someone about how he plans to get custody of the twins just to use them as leverage to force you to give him half of your assets. The twins. Clara's hands clenched into fists. He'd already planned that too. He'd thrown her out knowing he was going to turn around and fight for custody, not because he wanted his children, but because he could use them as bargaining chips. And this, Margaret said, pulling out one final document, is his actual plan for the children. We intercepted an email he sent to Vanessa 2 weeks before you gave birth. She handed Clara a printed email, and Clara read it with mounting horror. Once the twins are born, I'll keep them just long enough to make Clara desperate. Then I'll offer her a deal. She gives me half of whatever the old man left her, and I'll sign away my parental rights. She'll jump at it. She's the type who'll pay anything to keep her kids. We'll be set for life. Clara looked up at Margaret, and she knew her face must have shown the fury burning through her, because Margaret nodded slowly. He never wanted them, Margaret said softly. He planned from the very beginning to use them, to use you, to take everything he could and leave you with nothing. For a long moment, Clara just sat there processing. 3 years of planning, 3 years of surveillance. Her father had seen all of this coming, had prepared for every possible move Marcus might make, and had built a case so comprehensive that it was almost overwhelming. "Why didn't my father just tell me?" Clara finally asked. "Why go through all of this? Why fake his death and hide and watch from the shadows instead of just warning me?" Margaret's expression softened, because he knew Marcus would have found a way to turn it around. Men like Marcus are excellent liars. If your father had come to you 3 years ago and said, "I think your husband is planning to betray you," Marcus would have convinced you it wasn't true. He would have said your father was paranoid, overprotective, trying to control you. He would have driven a wedge between you and Samuel, and you would have been even more isolated when he finally made his move. She was right. Clara knew she was right. If her father had told her 3 years ago that Marcus was having an affair, that he was planning to use her, Clara wouldn't have believed it. She'd loved Marcus too much. She'd trusted him too completely. Your father knew the only way to protect you was to give you undeniable proof. Not suspicions, not warnings, but evidence so overwhelming that you couldn't doubt it, couldn't rationalize it away. He knew that Marcus would eventually show his true colors, and when he did, you'd need more than just your word against his. You'd need documentation, legal ammunition, a case so strong that Marcus couldn't fight it even if he hired the best lawyers in the country. Margaret walked around the desk and sat down across from Clara again. "So here's what we're going to do. We have 2 options. Option 1, we strike immediately. We file for divorce, for custody, for asset seizure, everything at once. We bury him in paperwork and evidence, and we crush him before he even knows what's happening." She paused, and Clara saw something calculating in her eyes. Option 2, we use what I call the rope-a-dope strategy. We let Marcus think he's won. We let him get comfortable, overconfident. We let him make mistakes. Because men like Marcus, when they think they've gotten away with something, they get sloppy. They start bragging. They stop being careful. And every mistake he makes just adds to our case, makes our position stronger. Clara thought about it. Part of her wanted option 1. Part of her wanted to strike immediately, to see the look on Marcus's face when he realized everything he thought he had was actually hers. But another part of her, the part that had been shaped by her father's strategic thinking, saw the wisdom in option 2. "How long would we wait?" Clara asked. 3, maybe 4 weeks. Let him settle into the mansion with Vanessa. Let him think he's safe. And then we hit him with everything at once. We serve him with eviction papers and asset freezes at his own front door, in front of his neighbors, in front of everyone. We take away not just his assets, but his reputation, his dignity, his sense of security. Margaret leaned forward. "Men like Marcus hang themselves, Clara. We just have to provide the rope." Clara looked at the filing cabinets, at the folders spread across the desk, at the evidence of her father's love and protection that had survived his death. She thought about Marcus, probably sitting in her mansion right now, laughing with Vanessa about how easy it had been to get rid of her. She thought about her twins, who their father had planned to use as bargaining chips, and she made her decision. "We wait," Clara said, and her voice was steady and cold. "We give him rope and then we watch him hang himself with it." Margaret smiled. It was not a nice smile. It was the smile of a predator who'd just been given permission to hunt. "I was hoping you'd say that. Now let's get you and those babies somewhere safe. I have an apartment, fully furnished, paid for by your father's estate. It's secure, it's comfortable, and it's yours for as long as you need it." She stood up and started gathering files. "For the next few weeks you rest, you heal, you take care of your children, and you let Marcus think he's won. Because when we're done with him, Clara, he's going to wish he'd never heard your name." Clara stood too, and for the first time since that terrible day when Marcus threw her out, she felt something other than pain and fear. She felt powerful. She felt ready. Her father had spent 3 years building her an arsenal. Margaret had spent 3 years learning how to use it, and Marcus Thompson had no idea what was coming for him. None at all. 3 weeks. That's how long Clara waited. 3 weeks of watching from a distance while Marcus and Vanessa played house in her mansion. 3 weeks of Margaret's investigators documenting every arrogant mistake they made. 3 weeks of Marcus posting on social media about his success, his beautiful home, his perfect life. 3 weeks of him thinking he'd gotten away with it. And then, on a quiet Sunday morning, everything changed. The neighborhood was one of those places where nothing exciting ever happens. Manicured lawns, expensive cars in driveways, the kind of street where people know each other just enough to wave, but not enough to actually be involved in each other's lives. Sunday mornings were sacred here. People slept in, made elaborate breakfasts, read the newspaper on their perfectly decorated porches. So when a black Rolls-Royce Phantom turned onto the street at exactly 9:30 in the morning, people noticed. This wasn't the kind of car you saw every day, even in this neighborhood. This was the kind of car that cost more than most of these houses. Long, sleek windows tinted so dark you couldn't see inside, moving slowly and deliberately down the street like a shark through water. Mrs. Chen, who lived 2 houses down and had been watering her roses, stopped mid-spray and watched. Mr. Patterson, out walking his golden retriever, actually stopped on the sidewalk. The Johnsons, who'd been loading their kids into their SUV for soccer practice, paused to look. The Rolls-Royce pulled up directly in front of Clara's mansion. The mansion that everyone on the street believed belonged to Marcus Thompson, that successful finance guy who'd recently had twins with his wife. Except nobody had seen the wife in weeks, and there was a new woman living there now. People had talked about it, of course, whispered about it at neighborhood barbecues, but nobody had said anything directly. That wasn't how things worked in places like this. The car sat there for a moment, engine purring, and more neighbors started emerging from their houses. Something was happening. You could feel it in the air. People pulled out their phones, not quite sure why yet, but knowing instinctively that whatever was about to happen, they wanted it recorded. Then the driver's door opened, and a man in a crisp black suit stepped out. Professional, serious, the kind of person who looked like they meant business. He walked around to the passenger side and opened the rear door. Clara stepped out, and she was transformed. Gone was the bleeding, desperate woman in a hospital gown who'd been thrown out 3 weeks ago. This Clara wore a designer suit, charcoal grey with subtle pinstripes, tailored perfectly to her frame. Her hair, which had been falling out in clumps from stress 3 weeks ago, was styled immaculately, swept back in a sophisticated updo. She wore minimal makeup, but what she had on was expertly applied. Diamond earrings, subtle but real. Heels that added 3 inches to her height. But it wasn't the clothes or the hair or the jewelry that made people stare. It was the way she carried herself. She moved like someone who owned the world and knew it. Confident, powerful, absolutely certain of her right to be exactly where she was. Behind her, 3 more car doors opened. Margaret Hale emerged from the passenger side, equally impeccable in a burgundy suit, carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than a used car. Two younger associates, a man and a woman, both in expensive suits, both carrying briefcases of their own, stepped out from a second vehicle that had pulled up behind the Rolls-Royce, and then, from a third vehicle, 4 police officers emerged. 2 men, 2 women, all in uniform, all looking very official and very serious. By now at least 15 neighbors were outside watching. Phone cameras were up. This was definitely something. Nobody knew what yet, but it was something. Clara didn't acknowledge the neighbors. She didn't wave or smile or explain. She just walked up the long driveway toward the mansion's front door, Margaret beside her, the associates behind them, the police officers bringing up the rear. It was a procession, a deliberate theatrical demonstration of power. When they reached the front door, Margaret nodded to one of the police officers. He stepped forward and knocked. Loud, official, the kind of knock that says, "This is not a social call." Inside the house, Marcus had been enjoying his Sunday morning. He'd woken up late, had coffee in bed with Vanessa, was lounging around in his expensive bathrobe, feeling very pleased with himself. The house was his. The life was his. Clara was gone, probably living in some shelter somewhere, broken and defeated. Everything had gone exactly according to plan, so when he heard the knock, he was annoyed more than anything. Who the hell was interrupting his Sunday morning? He walked to the door, Vanessa trailing behind him in a silk negligée, and yanked it open with an irritated expression already on his face. And there was Clara. For a second, Marcus's brain couldn't process what he was seeing. Clara was supposed to be destroyed. She was supposed to be broken. She was supposed to be nowhere near here. But here she was, looking like she'd just stepped off the cover of a business magazine. And behind her were lawyers and police officers, and oh God, something was very wrong. "What the hell are you?" Marcus started, but one of the police officers cut him off. "Mr. Marcus Thompson?" Marcus nodded dumbly, still trying to understand what was happening. The officer handed him a thick envelope. "You're being served with eviction papers. You have 48 hours to vacate these premises." Marcus stared at the envelope like it was a snake. "What? No, there's some mistake. This is my house. You can't evict me from my own house." A second officer handed him another envelope. "Asset freeze orders. As of 8 o'clock this morning, all accounts associated with Thompson Capital and your personal banking have been frozen pending legal review." The color drained from Marcus's face. "What are you talking about? Who authorized this? You can't just freeze my accounts." That's when Margaret stepped forward. She had the kind of smile that lawyers develop after years of destroying people in court. Pleasant, professional. Absolutely terrifying if you knew what you were looking at. "Your house," Margaret said, her voice carrying clearly. "That's interesting, Mr. Thompson. See, I have the deed right here." She pulled a document from her briefcase and held it up. The neighbors were pressing closer now, trying to hear, trying to see. This was better than anything on TV. "This house," Margaret continued, raising her voice so everyone could hear, "is owned by the Ward Family Trust, established by Samuel Ward 3 years ago. The sole beneficiary of that trust is his daughter, Clara Ward Thompson. The house was purchased in the trust's name with trust funds, and the deed has always listed the trust as the legal owner." Marcus's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Behind him, Vanessa had gone very pale. "Your company," Margaret went on, clearly enjoying herself now. "Thompson Capital was funded entirely by loans from Samuel Ward, loans that you signed for, Mr. Thompson, with Clara listed as guarantor. Loans that include very specific clauses about what happens in the event of fraud or infidelity." She pulled out another document. "As of this morning, those loans have been called in due to breach of contract. All assets purchased with those funds, including your office building, your equipment, and your business accounts, now belong to Clara Ward Thompson." The neighbors were murmuring now, phones definitely recording. This was incredible. Marcus Thompson, who everyone thought was so successful, apparently owned nothing. It was all this woman's, his wife's, the wife he'd kicked out for his mistress. "Furthermore," Margaret said, and her voice got harder now, "we have documented evidence of fraud, conspiracy, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit parental kidnapping. The district attorney's office has been notified, and will be filing charges within the week. Marcus finally found his voice. "This is insane. You can't do this. I'll fight this. You'll what?" Clara said quietly, speaking for the first time. Her voice was soft, but it cut through Marcus's bluster like a knife. She stepped forward, and Marcus actually stepped back. This wasn't the Clara he knew. This wasn't the woman he'd married, the woman he'd controlled and manipulated and thrown away. This was someone else entirely. "You threw me out in the rain 3 days after I gave birth to your children," Clara said, speaking so quietly that only Marcus could hear her. The neighbors couldn't make out the words, but they could see Marcus's face going white. "You called me stupid. You called me the cash cow. You and Vanessa planned to use our children as leverage to extort money from me. You never loved me. You never loved them. You just wanted what you thought my father had." She took another step closer, and Marcus was pressed against his own doorframe, now trapped. "You underestimated me," Clara said. "That was your mistake. My father spent 3 years preparing for this moment. 3 years documenting every lie you told, every plan you made, every cruel thing you said about me when you thought no one was listening. We have everything, Marcus. Everything. And now you have nothing." She stepped past him, walking into the house. Her house. Margaret and the associates followed. The police officers remained outside with Marcus, making sure he understood that he wasn't going anywhere, that he was going to stand there and take this. Clara walked through the foyer, looking at everything Marcus had changed in the 3 weeks since he'd thrown her out. Vanessa's taste was everywhere. New furniture, new art, new everything, all purchased with Clara's money from Clara's accounts. She turned back to look at Marcus, still standing in the doorway, frozen, his bathrobe hanging open, his perfect life disintegrating in front of an audience of neighbors with their phones out, recording every humiliating second. 48 hours, Clara said clearly. "You have 48 hours to get your belongings out of my house. After that, anything you leave behind becomes my property, and you'll be arrested for trespassing if you set foot on this property again." Vanessa, who'd been silent this whole time, suddenly found her voice. "Marcus, do something. Call someone. This can't be legal." But Marcus just stood there because he knew. Maybe he didn't know all the details yet, didn't understand exactly how completely he'd been trapped, but he knew enough. He knew he'd been caught. He knew that everything he'd thought was his had never actually belonged to him at all. Clara walked through the mansion, and with every step, she was reclaiming not just her house, but her dignity, her power, her life. The neighbors outside were still recording, still watching. By tonight, this would be all over social media. By tomorrow, everyone Marcus knew would have seen it. His reputation, his image, his carefully constructed facade of success, all of it was crumbling in real time. And Clara? Clara walked through her home with her head held high, Margaret beside her, and she knew that this was just the beginning. Marcus thought this was rock bottom. He thought this public humiliation, this loss of the house and the accounts, was the worst thing that could happen to him. He had no idea. Clara was just getting started. What happened next was going to be diabolical. Margaret Hale sat across from Clara in the mansion's newly reclaimed study, her expression grave. The afternoon light filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the mahogany desk that had once belonged to Clara's father. Margaret had seen this pattern play out dozens of times in her career, and she knew exactly what was coming next. "He'll come for the children," Margaret said, her voice steady and certain. "Not because he wants them, Clara, but because they're the only leverage he has left." Clara's hands tightened around her coffee cup. The twins were sleeping upstairs, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around them. "You think he'd actually try for custody?" she asked, though somewhere deep inside she already knew the answer. Margaret leaned forward, her eyes sharp with the wisdom of someone who'd spent decades in courtrooms watching desperate people make predictable moves. Men like Marcus don't care about their children. They care about winning. And right now, you've stripped him of everything he thought was his house, his money, his reputation. The children are all he has left to hurt you with. The words hung in the air like a threat, and Clara felt a chill run down her spine despite the warmth of the room. 2 days later, Margaret's prediction came true with devastating accuracy. Clara was in the nursery, changing one of the twins, when her phone buzzed with an email notification. The subject line made her blood run cold. Emergency custody filing, Thompson v's ward. Her hands trembled as she opened the attachment, scanning the legal document that Marcus's attorney had filed with the family court. The claims were outrageous, almost laughably so if they weren't so dangerous. Marcus alleged that Clara was mentally unstable, that she had abandoned the marital home without cause, that she was providing an unfit environment for the children. He painted himself as the concerned father, worried about his newborn twins being cared for by a woman who was clearly suffering from postpartum psychosis. The document was filled with twisted half-truths and outright lies, each one carefully crafted to make Clara look like an unfit mother. She called Margaret immediately, her voice shaking with a mixture of rage and fear. "He's actually doing it. He's going after my babies." Margaret's response was calm, almost eerily so. "I know. I just received the filing. This is good news, Clara." "Good news?" Clara wanted to scream. How could any of this be good news? But Margaret continued, her voice taking on that strategic tone that Clara had come to recognize. "This is Marcus being predictable. He's desperate, and desperate men make mistakes. We're going to use that." That evening, Margaret laid out her plan in the same study where they'd talked just days before. "I want you to invite him to dinner," Margaret said, watching Clara's face carefully. "Tell him you want to discuss a peaceful resolution for the children's sake." Clara stared at her attorney as if she'd lost her mind. "You want me to sit across from the man who threw me out in the rain, who's now trying to take my children, and pretend that I'm willing to negotiate with him?" Margaret's expression didn't waver. "I want you to give him enough rope to hang himself with. Trust me on this, Clara. Marcus thinks he's won. He thinks the custody filing has you terrified and desperate. Let him believe that. Let him get comfortable enough to tell you the truth." Clara's mind raced, understanding slowly dawning on her face. "You want him to confess what he's really after." Margaret smiled, a predator's smile. "Exactly, and we're going to record every single word." The preparation for that dinner was meticulous. Margaret's team spent an entire afternoon wiring the mansion's dining room with hidden cameras and microphones. Tiny lenses were embedded in the light fixtures, pointed directly at where Marcus would sit. Microphones, no bigger than shirt buttons, were carefully concealed in the elaborate floral centerpiece Clara had arranged. The dining room looked elegant and innocent, the perfect setting for a reconciliation dinner. In reality, it was a trap, carefully baited and ready to spring. Clara spent the day of the dinner rehearsing with Margaret, practicing how to play the role of a desperate, broken woman. It went against every instinct she had. After weeks of reclaiming her power, of standing tall and taking back what was hers, the idea of pretending to be weak made her sick. But she understood the necessity. Marcus would only reveal his true intentions if he believed he had the upper hand. When Marcus arrived that evening, Clara opened the door herself, making sure her eyes were slightly red, as if she'd been crying. She'd dressed simply, deliberately choosing an outfit that made her look smaller, more vulnerable. Marcus walked in with the confidence of a man who believed he'd already won, his expensive suit perfectly tailored, his smile cold and calculating. They sat down at the dining table, and Clara served the meal with trembling hands that were only partially an act. Every moment sitting across from this man who had betrayed her so completely made her want to throw the truth in his face, to watch him realize that he'd walked straight into a trap. But she held back, playing her part perfectly. "Marcus," she began, her voice carefully modulated to sound pleading, "I just want what's best for the twins. This fighting, the lawyers, the court filings, it's not good for anyone." She reached across the table as if seeking connection. "We can share custody. We can split the assets. I just want peace for our children." Marcus cut into his steak, chewing slowly, making her wait for his response. When he finally spoke, his voice dripped with condescension. "Clara, you never understood how the world works." He leaned back in his chair, wine glass in hand, looking for all the world like a king holding court. "Here's what's going to happen," he continued. his comfort with the situation making him careless. "You're going to learn a very important lesson about leverage." Clara forced herself to look confused, to play into his ego. "I don't understand," she said softly. Exactly the response he wanted to hear. Marcus smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "The children, Clara. I don't actually want the children. Let's be honest here." He took another sip of wine, and Clara's heart pounded so hard she was certain he could hear it. "Their leverage. They're the only card I have left to play, and I'm going to play it perfectly." He leaned forward now, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone, as if he were letting her in on a secret. "Here's the deal. You give me half of the trust assets and I disappear. I'll drop the custody suit, sign whatever papers you want, and you'll never hear from me again." His eyes glittered with triumph. "Otherwise, I drag you through court for years. Every penny your father left you will go to legal fees. The twins will grow up in courtrooms, shuttled between lawyers' offices, their childhood destroyed by custody battles and depositions." Clara felt bile rise in her throat, but she kept her expression neutral, waiting for him to continue. "Your father's dead, Clara," Marcus said, his voice taking on a cruel edge. "His little plan, his trust, his attempt to protect you, none of it matters, because in the end I always win. That's how the world works. The person willing to cause the most damage always wins, and I'm willing to destroy everything if it means I get what I deserve." The words hung in the air, each one more damning than the last. This was it. The full confession of his intentions, his complete disregard for his own children, his willingness to use them as weapons. Every word was being recorded in crystal-clear audio and video, undeniable evidence of his true character. Clara felt something shift inside her. The desperate, broken woman she'd been pretending to be evaporated like morning mist. Her posture straightened, her eyes cleared, and when she looked at Marcus now it was with the cold, calculated gaze of someone who had just won the game. Marcus noticed the change immediately, his confident smile faltering. Clara reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, placing it on the table between them. With one tap, Marcus's own voice filled the dining room. "I don't actually want the children, they're leverage." His face went pale as he heard himself continue, each damning sentence playing back with perfect clarity. "You give me half of the trust assets and I disappear." "You were right about one thing, Marcus," Clara said, her voice steady and strong. "My father did prepare me. He taught me something invaluable in that video he left." She stood up, looking down at him as he sat frozen in his chair, the color draining from his face. "He taught me to be patient. He taught me to let arrogant men talk, to let them hang themselves with their own words. And you just gave me everything I need to bury you in court." Marcus's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The realization of what he'd just done, of how completely he'd been played, crashed over him like a wave. Clara picked up her phone, stopping the recording. "My attorney has been watching this entire conversation in real time. Every word you said is now evidence. Your custody claim? It's done. Your attempt to extort me, documented. Your admission that you see your own children as nothing more than leverage. The judge is going to love that." She walked to the door and opened it, a clear dismissal. "Get out of my house, Marcus, and the next time you see me, it will be in court, where I'm going to make sure you never get the chance to hurt these children again." Marcus stumbled to his feet, his earlier confidence completely shattered, and walked to the door like a man in a daze. As he passed Clara, she added one final thing. "Oh, and Marcus, my father's plan worked perfectly. Because unlike you, he understood that the person who wins isn't the one willing to cause the most damage. It's the one who's smart enough to let their opponent destroy themselves." The door closed behind him, and Clara leaned against it, her heart still racing. Margaret would be thrilled. They had everything they needed now, handed to them by Marcus's own arrogance and greed. The trap had worked perfectly, and Marcus had walked right into it. Too blinded by his own Marcus Thompson was a man who had built his entire identity on appearances. So when his world started crumbling, when Clara had systematically dismantled everything he thought he owned, he did what desperate men always do. He doubled down on the illusion. 2 weeks after the dinner recording disaster, Marcus decided to throw a party. Not just any party, but a massive rooftop celebration at one of the most exclusive venues in the city. The kind of party that screamed success, power, and untouchability. He maxed out one of his few remaining credit cards to the tune of $50,000. $50,000 he didn't have, for a party designed to convince everyone that he was still winning. The invitations went out to every business associate, every social connection, every person whose opinion Marcus had ever valued. The message was clear. I'm still here. I'm still powerful. That woman didn't break me. What Marcus didn't know was that Margaret Hale had been waiting for exactly this kind of move. She'd seen it 100 times before. Arrogant men, backed into corners, always threw one last lavish party before the final collapse. It was like watching a building implode in slow motion, and Margaret had front row seats. The evening started exactly as Marcus had planned. The rooftop venue was stunning, overlooking the city skyline. Champagne flowed freely. A live jazz band played in the corner. Waiters circulated with expensive hors d'oeuvres. Marcus stood at the center of it all, wearing his most expensive suit, his smile wide and confident. He worked the room like a politician, shaking hands, laughing too loudly, telling everyone who would listen that the rumors about him were nothing more than a bitter ex-wife's revenge fantasy. But Margaret's investigators were already there, blending seamlessly into the crowd. They weren't there to stop anything. They were there to watch, to document, and to wait, because Margaret knew something Marcus didn't understand. You can't rebuild a reputation at a party when the foundation of your lies is already crumbling on social media. About an hour into the celebration, something shifted. One of the guests, a distinguished older gentleman in a grey suit, started talking a bit too loudly near the bar. His name was Richard Chen, and he had been one of Samuel Ward's oldest business associates. Richard had received a very interesting phone call from Margaret's office earlier that week, and he'd been more than happy to attend Marcus's little party. Richard's voice carried across the rooftop as he spoke to a small group of guests. He wasn't whispering. He wasn't being subtle. And every word he said was absolutely true. He talked about how he'd known Samuel Ward for over 20 years, how Samuel had been one of the sharpest financial minds he'd ever encountered. Then he mentioned, almost casually, how Samuel had once told him about the young man who'd married his daughter, the young man who had no business sense, no real capital, no actual skills, but plenty of ambition and even more arrogance. The group around Richard grew larger. People started listening. Richard continued, explaining how every dollar of Marcus Thompson's supposed business success had actually come from Samuel Ward's investments, how Marcus had contributed exactly nothing to his own company except his name on the paperwork. The conversations around the rooftop started to shift. Phones came out not for party photos, but for frantic Google searches. Someone found the news article about the mansion eviction. Within minutes, it was being passed from phone to phone like wildfire. The social media posts from Clara's neighbors, the ones who had filmed Marcus standing in his bathrobe as police served him eviction papers, started making the rounds. Guests huddled in corners, whispering, showing each other their screens. The carefully constructed illusion Marcus had spent $50,000 to create was dissolving in real time. Marcus noticed. Of course he noticed. He saw the sideways glances, the sudden silence when he approached certain groups. He saw people checking their phones and then looking at him with barely concealed shock or disgust. His smile became more forced, his laughter more desperate. He tried to control the narrative, pulling people aside to explain, to justify, to spin the story in his favor. But it was too late. The truth was spreading faster than he could contain it. Then Vanessa arrived. Marcus hadn't invited her. After the custody filing and the disastrous dinner recording, they'd barely spoken. She'd been avoiding his calls, and he'd assumed she was just laying low until everything blew over. But there she was, stepping onto the rooftop in a black dress, looking nervous and determined in equal measure. Marcus's face went pale the moment he saw her. Something about the way she walked, the way she avoided his eyes, told him this wasn't a social visit. Vanessa walked straight to the center of the space, near where the band had just finished a song. In the brief moment of silence, her voice rang out clear and steady. She announced that she had something important to say, something everyone needed to hear. The entire party stopped. Every conversation died. Every eye turned toward her. She told them everything. She told them about the affair, about the plan to push Clara out and take over the mansion. She told them about the embezzlement from her own company, about how she and Marcus had been siphoning funds for months to support their lifestyle. And then she delivered the final blow. She told them that she'd cut a deal with prosecutors, that Clara had all the evidence, and that she was cooperating fully in exchange for reduced charges. Marcus's face went from pale to bright red in seconds. He lunged toward Vanessa, screaming that she was a liar, a traitor, that she'd destroyed everything. Security guards grabbed him before he could reach her, holding him back as he struggled and shouted. Vanessa didn't flinch. She simply turned and walked away, leaving Marcus thrashing in the grip of two large men, while 100 guests watched in stunned silence. And then Marcus completely fell apart. The facade he'd been maintaining for weeks, maybe years, shattered entirely. He started screaming at the guests, calling them fake friends, accusing them of abandoning him. He grabbed a champagne glass from a nearby table and threw it against the wall, where it exploded in a shower of crystal and alcohol. He overturned a table of appetizers. He pointed at random people and shouted incoherent accusations. It was a complete, total public meltdown, and at least a dozen people were recording every second of it. Security eventually escorted him from his own party. The guests stood in awkward clusters, unsure whether to leave or stay. Most of them left within the next 20 minutes, whispering to each other as they headed for the exits. By midnight, the video of Marcus's breakdown had been uploaded to social media. By morning, it had hundreds of thousands of views. The caption that went viral was simple and devastating. "Mansion fraudster has public breakdown." You think Marcus is finished? The courtroom battle is about to expose something even worse. Keep watching. The morning of the custody hearing arrived with the weight of finality. This wasn't just another legal skirmish. This was the moment where everything would be decided, where the fate of Clara's children and her entire future would be determined by 12 years of law school and one person in a black robe. The family court building was swarmed with reporters before the doors even opened. News vans lined the street. Cameras were positioned at every entrance. Marcus's very public meltdown at the rooftop party had turned this case into a media spectacle, and everyone wanted to see how it would end. Marcus arrived first, flanked by 2 lawyers in expensive suits. These weren't the attorneys who had represented him in the initial asset disputes. Those lawyers had quietly withdrawn after the party incident, citing irreconcilable differences. These new lawyers were the kind you hire when you're desperate, the kind who take cases on credit and payment plans, because they know they're representing someone who's already lost everything. Marcus looked haggard. His suit was expensive but rumpled, like he'd slept in it. His eyes were bloodshot, ringed with dark circles. He'd aged 10 years in the past 2 months. Then Clara arrived, and the contrast couldn't have been more stark. She stepped out of a town car wearing a tailored navy suit that conveyed both professionalism and maternal warmth. Her hair was pulled back simply, her makeup minimal. She wasn't trying to look powerful or intimidating. She was trying to look like exactly what she was, a mother fighting for her children. Behind her, a nanny carried the twins in a double stroller. The babies were dressed in matching outfits, peaceful and completely unaware of the battle being waged over their futures. Clara had brought them intentionally. She wanted the judge to see what this case was really about. The courtroom itself was packed to capacity. Every seat in the gallery was filled with journalists, legal observers, and people who had followed the story online. The judge, a woman named Patricia Winters, who had been on the family court bench for over 15 years, entered with an expression that suggested she'd already read every piece of paperwork, watched every video, and formed at least a preliminary opinion about what was going to happen today. Margaret Hale stood to present Clara's case, and from the very first moment it was clear this wasn't going to be a fair fight. Margaret had spent 3 years preparing for this exact moment. Every document was organized, every argument rehearsed, every piece of evidence authenticated and ready to be entered into the record. She began with the trust documents, the irrefutable proof that every asset Marcus claimed as his own actually belonged to Clara through the Ward family trust. She projected the documents on a screen, walking the judge through the dates, the signatures, the legal structures that Samuel Ward had so carefully constructed. The financial records came next, a devastating timeline of Marcus's complete financial dependence on Clara's family. Margaret showed bank statements, investment records, loan documents, all of which proved that Marcus Thompson had contributed exactly $0 to the marriage or to his own business. Every penny had come from Samuel Ward, and every penny was legally Clara's property. The judge took notes, her expression growing progressively more severe as the evidence mounted. Then came the dinner recording, and this was the moment that would define the entire case. Margaret played the audio for the courtroom, Marcus's voice coming through the speakers with crystal clarity. His own words condemned him more effectively than any argument Margaret could have made. The courtroom listened in silence as Marcus admitted on tape that he didn't want his children, that they were nothing more than leverage, that he planned to drag Clara through years of legal battles just to extort money from her. When the recording ended, the silence in the courtroom was deafening. Even Marcus's lawyers looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats and avoiding eye contact with their client. Margaret continued with the surveillance evidence, 3 years' worth of videos and photographs documenting Marcus and Vanessa's affair, their planning sessions, their discussions about how to push Clara out and take control of the mansion. The judge watched clip after clip, her expression growing colder with each revelation. These weren't grainy, questionable images. These were high-definition videos with clear audio, the kind of evidence that left absolutely no room for interpretation or doubt. Finally, Margaret called character witnesses, and this is where the case moved from legal arguments to something far more personal and damning. Hospital staff took the stand, nurses and administrators who had been present during Clara's emergency cesarean section and the 3 days she'd spent recovering. They testified that Marcus had never visited, never called, never once checked on his wife or his newborn children. One nurse, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a matter-of-fact demeanor, testified that she'd found Clara crying alone in her hospital room, struggling to hold both twins while recovering from major surgery because her husband was too busy to be there. The emotional impact of that testimony rippled through the courtroom. Even the court reporter looked affected. When Margaret finally sat down, she'd presented a case so comprehensive, so thoroughly documented, that there seemed to be nothing left to argue. But Marcus's lawyers had to try. They stood and began their defense with the only strategy available to them. They tried to paint Marcus as a reformed man, someone who had made mistakes but was now committed to being a father. They talked about his willingness to attend parenting classes, his desire to be involved in his children's lives, his recognition that he needed to change. It might have been convincing if Marcus hadn't been required to take the stand. The cross-examination was brutal, and Marcus fell apart almost immediately. Margaret asked him simple, straightforward questions, the kind of questions any involved parent should be able to answer without hesitation. "What's the name of your children's pediatrician?" Marcus stammered, guessed wrong, then admitted he didn't know. What were their birth weights? He couldn't remember. The twins had been born just 6 weeks ago, and he couldn't remember their birth weights. When were they born? Marcus got the date wrong by 2 days. The courtroom watched as Marcus Thompson, the man who claimed he wanted custody of his children, proved beyond any doubt that he knew virtually nothing about them. He didn't know what formula they drank, what their feeding schedule was, whether they'd had any medical appointments since birth. He couldn't name a single developmental milestone they'd reached. He was in every measurable way a complete stranger to his own children. And then Margaret asked the question that ended everything. "Why do you want custody, Mr. Thompson?" Marcus's lawyer objected immediately, but the judge overruled it. She wanted to hear his answer. Marcus, flustered and angry and humiliated by his performance so far, finally cracked. His face went red, his jaw clenched, and he shouted into the microphone that he just wanted what he was owed. He'd been married to Clara for 5 years. He'd built that business, lived in that mansion, and he deserved compensation. The children were his leverage, his only way to get what was rightfully his. The courtroom erupted. Marcus's lawyers tried to salvage the situation, to claim he'd misspoken, that the stress had caused him to phrase things poorly, but the damage was done. Marcus had just admitted, under oath and in front of a judge, that he viewed his children as financial assets rather than human beings he loved and wanted to protect. His lawyers requested a recess. The judge denied it. She'd heard enough. Judge Patricia Winters took less than 10 minutes to render her decision. She granted Clara full legal and physical custody of both children, with only supervised visitation rights for Marcus. Every single asset was confirmed as Clara's property through the Ward family trust. Marcus was ordered to pay all of Clara's legal fees, a sum that would likely bankrupt him completely, given that he had no actual assets of his own. A restraining order was issued, prohibiting Marcus from coming within 500 feet of Clara or the children except during his supervised visits. But Judge Winters wasn't finished. She did something that family court judges rarely do. She commented for the record on Marcus Thompson's character. She stated that in her 15 years on the bench, she had never seen such a shocking lack of parental fitness, such a transparent attempt to use children as pawns in a financial dispute. She noted that Marcus had shown no genuine interest in his children's well-being, no understanding of their needs, and no capacity to put their interests above his own vindictiveness. Her words would be part of the permanent legal record, ensuring that if Marcus ever tried to petition for increased custody in the future, any judge reviewing the case would see exactly what kind of father he'd proven himself to be. Marcus sat frozen in his chair, his face ashen, as the judge delivered her ruling. His lawyers packed up their briefcases quickly, already calculating how fast they could withdraw from representing him. Clara, meanwhile, sat quietly with tears streaming down her face. But these weren't tears of sadness or relief. They were tears of vindication, of justice finally served, of knowing that her children were safe, and that the man who had thrown her into the rain would never have power over her again. 2 months had passed since the courtroom victory, and for the first time in what felt like years, Clara could finally breathe. The mansion had been completely transformed. Every trace of Marcus had been systematically erased and replaced with something that felt authentically hers. The master bedroom where he once slept had been converted into a peaceful nursery for the twins. The home office where he'd plotted with Vanessa was now a bright playroom filled with soft toys and pastel colors. Even the driveway had been repaved, as if Clara needed to remove even the tire marks of his presence from her property. Life had settled into a rhythm that felt almost surreal in its normalcy. Morning feedings, afternoon walks around the estate, evening baths for the babies. Clara had hired a part-time nanny, not because she needed the help, but because Margaret had insisted she take time for herself. The twins were thriving. They were sleeping through the night now, their little personalities beginning to emerge. One was quieter, more observant. The other was already showing signs of her grandfather's determination, crying louder and longer when she wanted something. Clara had started to believe that maybe, just maybe, the war was over. Marcus hadn't attempted contact since the court hearing. The restraining order was in place. His supervised visitation rights remained unused because he'd never even scheduled a single visit. It seemed he'd finally accepted defeat and disappeared into whatever hole he'd crawled into after losing everything. Clara had even started making plans for the future, sketching out ideas for the foundation her father had left her, thinking about how she could turn her nightmare into something that would help other women. She should have known better. Men like Marcus don't go quietly into the night. They don't accept loss with grace. They wait, and they plot, and they come back swinging one last time. The legal papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a process server who looked apologetic as he handed them over. Clara's hands trembled as she read the motion header, and for a moment she was transported back to that rainy bus stop, feeling just as helpless and vulnerable as she had 2 months ago. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by something colder and harder. Marcus had filed a new motion, and this one was particularly vicious. He was claiming family unity as grounds for renewed custody consideration, arguing that children needed both parents and that he'd been unjustly denied the opportunity to be a father. But that wasn't the worst of it. He was demanding a full forensic audit of the Ward family trust, with the implication buried in the legal language that Samuel's wealth might have been obtained through illegal means. Money laundering, tax evasion, fraud. He was accusing her dead father of being a criminal, trying to taint the very foundation of Clara's victory. And then came the final insult, the move that showed just how desperate and cruel Marcus had become. He was requesting court-ordered DNA testing for both twins, with language that strongly implied he had reason to believe Clara had been unfaithful during their marriage. He was calling her an adulteress in legal documents that would become part of public record. He was suggesting that the children he'd thrown out into the rain might not even be his, despite knowing full well that they were. Clara called Margaret immediately, her voice shaking with rage, but Margaret's response was calm, almost pleased. This was exactly what they'd been waiting for, she explained. Marcus had just handed them the rope to hang himself with one final time. Every claim he was making could be systematically destroyed, and in doing so, he would cement his reputation as a vindictive, manipulative man who cared nothing for his children's well-being. The hearing came faster than Clara expected. Marcus's lawyers had pushed for an emergency motion, probably hoping to catch Clara off guard. Instead, they walked into a courtroom where Margaret had prepared for every possible angle of attack. The judge was the same one who had presided over the original custody hearing, and Clara could see the moment he recognized Marcus's name on the docket. His expression shifted from neutral judicial professionalism to barely concealed irritation. Margaret presented the trust audit first. It had actually been completed months ago as part of Clara's own due diligence, and every single dollar could be traced back to legitimate business transactions. Samuel Ward's career as an asset manager was documented across 3 decades of tax returns, investment records, and client testimonials. There was nothing even remotely questionable about the source of his wealth. Marcus's insinuations crumbled under the weight of paper evidence that filled 3 bankers' boxes. Then came the DNA results. Marcus had demanded them, so Clara had agreed immediately, knowing exactly what they would show. The lab report was unambiguous. Marcus Thompson was confirmed as the biological father of both twins with over 99% certainty. His own test, his own demand, had just proved that his accusations of infidelity were completely baseless. The judge asked Marcus's lawyer directly if there had been any actual evidence to support the infidelity claim, or if it had been pure speculation designed to hurt Clara's reputation. The lawyer's silence was deafening, but it was the judge's response that made the hearing truly memorable. He didn't just deny Marcus's motion, he eviscerated it. He spoke directly to Marcus, his voice carrying the weight of judicial authority and personal disgust. He called the motion a transparent attempt to harass a mother who had already proven herself capable and devoted. He noted that Marcus had not attempted even a single supervised visit with his children, despite having the legal right to do so. He observed that every claim Marcus had made had been proven false, and that the court's time had been wasted on what amounted to a vindictive fishing expedition. Then came the consequences. The judge didn't just deny the motion. He added 2 additional years to the supervised visitation requirement, meaning Marcus would now have to wait a total of 5 years before he could even petition for unsupervised time with his children. He ordered Marcus to complete parenting classes and anger management courses before any visitation could even be considered. And he warned Marcus, in no uncertain terms, that any further frivolous motions would result in him being barred from filing anything related to custody without prior court approval. Marcus sat there, his expensive suit unable to hide the defeated slump of his shoulders as the judge delivered the final blow. The court would be awarding Clara her legal fees for this hearing as well, adding another financial burden to a man who was already drowning in debt. As Clara walked out of the courtroom, she didn't feel triumphant. She felt tired of fighting, tired of Marcus's desperate attempts to hurt her. But she also felt something else, certainty. This really was over now. Marcus had thrown his last punch, and it had landed on nothing but air. The reporters were waiting outside the courthouse, a small crowd of them with cameras and microphones, shouting questions as Clara emerged into the afternoon sunlight. Margaret had warned her they might be there. The case had generated local media attention, particularly after Marcus's public meltdown at the party had gone viral. But Clara hadn't prepared a statement. She'd planned to simply walk past them to the waiting car, say nothing, and let the legal victory speak for itself. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the exhaustion of fighting for so long. Maybe it was the memory of herself at that bus stop, bleeding and broken and alone. Maybe it was the thought of other women watching this story unfold, women who were trapped in similar situations and needed to know that escape was possible. Whatever the reason, Clara found herself turning toward the cameras instead of away from them. The reporters surged forward, questions overlapping into an incomprehensible wall of noise. Clara raised one hand, and surprisingly, they quieted. She hadn't prepared these words. They came from somewhere deeper than strategy, more honest than calculation. "This isn't just my story," she told them, her voice steady despite the emotions churning inside her. "This is about every woman who's been underestimated, every mother who's been told she's not enough, every wife who's been treated as an asset rather than a person." She spoke about her father, about how he'd taught her that the best revenge isn't anger or bitterness. It's strategy, it's patience, it's letting arrogant people hang themselves with their own rope while you stand back and watch. "Marcus didn't lose because I'm vindictive," she said, looking directly into the nearest camera. "He lost because he was cruel to someone who was smarter than him. He mistook kindness for weakness. He mistook love for stupidity. And that was his fatal error." The clip was online within an hour. By evening, it had been shared thousands of times. By the next morning, it had reached 1 million views. Within 48 hours, that number had climbed to 10 million. Clara's phone wouldn't stop ringing with interview requests, speaking invitations, and messages from women sharing their own stories of survival. She'd become, quite accidentally, a symbol of something larger than her personal battle. 3 weeks after the hearing, Clara received a letter from her father's attorney. She'd thought everything had been settled, all of Samuel's affairs wrapped up and transferred to her control. But there was one final piece, one last gift he'd prepared before faking his death and disappearing to some unknown location where he could watch his plan unfold from a safe distance. The Ward Foundation for Women's Empowerment wasn't just an idea or a suggestion. It was fully formed, completely funded, and ready to launch. Samuel had set aside $10 million in an endowment, structured so that the foundation could operate in perpetuity on the investment returns alone. The mission was crystal clear: provide legal aid, emergency housing, and financial literacy programs for women escaping abusive or exploitative situations. Clara was named as the foundation's director, with full authority to shape its programs and priorities. But that wasn't all. The apartment building where Clara had stayed during those first desperate weeks after the eviction, the safe space Margaret had arranged, had actually been purchased by Samuel months before his fake death. He'd bought the entire building, and he'd left instructions for it to be converted into transitional housing for women in crisis. Clara stood in front of the building with the architect's plans in her hands, looking up at the windows where she'd once sat with her newborn twins, wondering if she'd ever feel safe again. Now this building would be a place where other women could find that same safety, that same second chance. 6 months after the final court hearing, Clara received an unexpected request. Marcus wanted to meet, not through lawyers this time, just the two of them in a neutral location for a conversation. Margaret advised against it, but Clara agreed. She chose a coffee shop near the courthouse, public enough to be safe, but quiet enough for privacy. The man who walked through the door barely resembled the Marcus she'd known. The expensive suits were gone, replaced by ordinary jeans and a simple shirt. The arrogant confidence had been stripped away, leaving behind something raw and broken. He was working a regular job now, something in retail management. He'd been attending therapy twice a week. The court-ordered classes had turned into voluntary counseling. He looked, for the first time since Clara had known him, like an actual human being rather than a performance of success. Marcus sat down across from her and didn't waste time with small talk. He told her he wanted to sign away his parental rights. He didn't deserve to be a father, he said. He'd proven that beyond any doubt. The twins would be better off without him, better off never knowing him at all. It was the right thing to do, the only honorable choice left to him. Clara listened to his speech, watched him struggle with tears he probably hadn't allowed himself to cry in years, and then she said the last thing he expected to hear. No. She told him she wasn't letting him off that easy. Signing away his rights would be the simple solution, the clean break that would allow him to walk away and never have to face what he'd done. But Clara wasn't interested in simple solutions anymore. She'd learned from her father that real change requires discomfort, requires facing consequences over the long term, rather than accepting a quick punishment and moving on. She laid out her terms. He had 5 years. 5 years to prove that he could become the kind of man who deserved to know his children. Every 6 months he would be evaluated, his progress monitored, his commitment tested. If he put in the actual work, if he genuinely changed rather than just performing change, then maybe, possibly, he might earn a supervised role in the twins' lives. But it would be on Clara's terms, for their benefit, never for his. Marcus asked why. Why give him any chance at all after everything he'd done? Clara's answer was simple. Because my children deserve the opportunity to have a father who actually loves them. Not the man you were, but the man you might become if you're willing to do the hardest work of your life. I'm not doing this for you, Marcus. I'm doing this for them. They'll grow up knowing that their mother gave their father every possible chance to be better, and whatever he did with that chance will be his responsibility, not mine. Marcus left the coffee shop crying, truly crying, perhaps for the first time since he was a child. Clara watched him go, and then returned home to her mansion, to her children, to the life she'd built from the ashes of the worst day of her existence. She closed the door behind her, picked up her daughter who was reaching for her with chubby arms, and smiled. The war was over. The victory was complete. But more than that, the future was finally genuinely hers.